Will a chuck roast recipe from 1967 be any good? Well, today we're gonna find out. So recently I've been on the search for some really old recipe books, specifically barbecue books. The reason for that is I wanna see what kind of recipes people were making long time ago and see if I could find anything interesting. And I'll tell you what, I found some very interesting recipes so far. A few weird things I found were some peanut butter pork chops as well as a peanut butter soup. There's something called whirling franks, which I will be doing a video on in the future. But today's recipe is a barbecued chuck roast, and I found it in this 1967 Betty Crocker outdoor cookbook. So if we look at the recipe here, what they want you to do is get a 3 to 4 pound chuck roast, 2.5 to 3 inches. And they also want it to be US choice grade. So I was able to find a choice grade chuck roast. It was only around 2.5 pounds, but it is 2.5 to 3 inches thick. So the way to get this prepared is they want you to make this California marinade that they show in here. So to do that, you want to go ahead, get a pot over medium heat, get a 1/4 cup of olive oil, add it to the pot, then add 2 crushed cloves of garlic to the oil and let that cook. Mix that up and then add 2 teaspoons of soy sauce and then let this cook for a little bit. Once that cooks a little bit, go ahead and add 1 teaspoon of rosemary and 1/2 teaspoon of dry mustard. After that, go ahead, pull it off the heat, add a 1/4 cup of wine vinegar. I was using red wine vinegar, and add a 1/4 cup of sherry or apple juice. And I decided to add a 1/4 cup of apple juice. And then just stir that up and your marinade is ready. Now they tell you to place the chuck roast in a shallow dish to marinate this in and flip it over constantly. Well, I didn't really want to do that, and I'm not sure if Ziploc bags were a real popular thing back in 1967, but that's what I decided to use. Once the marinade was ready, I went ahead, poured it into a Ziploc bag with that chuck roast inside, and I'd like to mention just let this marinade cool down before you go ahead and add it in there. Then they tell you to refrigerate this for 24 hours, turning the meat frequently. So after 24 hours, it says remove the meat from the marinade. Take that marinade, put it into a pot, reheat it, and add 2 tablespoons of catsup. I said catsup because that's what it says right here in the book. I'm assuming they mean ketchup. Obviously in 1967, Betty Crocker was calling it catsup. So go ahead, add that ketchup into the pan, mix it up, and then reheat this mixture. And this is gonna be used to baste the chuck roast while it cooks. So I've got my grill heated up. I'm using a kettle grill today with lump charcoal. I really like the lump charcoal over briquettes. And I've also added a couple chunks of hickory wood just for good measure. So now the instructions in this recipe say to put this chuck roast about 4 inches above the coals and just let it cook on there for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, flipping and basting every 5 to 6 minutes. Then they want you to cook it till it is brown on the outside but rare in the middle. So I'm gonna cook this thing till we get 125 degrees internal temperature. So I thought this recipe was interesting because whenever I decide to cook a chuck roast, I do a low and slow cook and cook it up to 200 degrees, so it's kind of like a brisket. Chuck roast is a very tough piece of meat, so that's why I don't think it's usually cooked too rare. So that's why I want to see how this comes out. It has been marinated for 24 hours, and I'll tell you what, that marinade smells fantastic. It's a super simple marinade, but it smells really nice, and I think it's gonna help tenderize this meat. So that's the recipe. So let's go ahead, get this out on the grill, and start cooking it. All right, grill is ready. Let's get this chuck roast on. Now I have my basting liquid right over here. I'm gonna leave it on the grill to keep it nice and warm. Here is our chuck roast. Let's get it on the grill. Now I just want to go ahead and baste the top. And flip it over real quick. Baste the other side. All right, now I'm just gonna let this go and I'm going to flip and baste it every 5 to 6 minutes for the next hour till we get to that 125 degree temperature. Here is the chuck roast. Now it smells fantastic. I'm very excited to give this a try. So I kept flipping and basting this thing every 5 minutes like the directions said, but I noticed after the first few flips, it was starting to get a little more charred than I liked. So I decided to move it a little further away from those coals. So I also took the marinade off the grill because it was starting to overcook and get a little thick. And after about 45 minutes, I decided to give it a temperature check, and I was at 142 degrees. Now I really wanted to cook this to a 125 internal because it says brown on the outside, rare in the middle. I was trying my best to follow this recipe to a T to see the results, but I found it was not working too well for me. It is a smaller chuck roast, so maybe with a bigger chuck roast it would have took an hour, but either way, this thing is finished. It smells great, so let's get it sliced up and see how it tastes. Alright, so I totally forgot to hit the record button when I cut this up, but check this out. It came out a lot better than I thought it would. Not as overcooked as I thought it might be. Smells so good. Looks fantastic. Check out the nice crust we got on there. And then just check out this nice slice that I got off of there. That's a nice looking chuck roast. The big test is to taste it and see if it's tender. So let's do that now. All right, so here's a nice slice of the chuck roast. Let's see how tender it is. Not too bad for a chuck roast. Now let's give it a try. This is really, really good. The flavors on that marinade are fantastic, and this thing is plenty tender. I'm very surprised at how tender this actually is, but the flavors are the big thing for me. It tastes so good. The rosemary in there is really nice. Everything you can taste just very subtly. The ketchup that you add in the recipe adds a nice little sweetness on there and kind of makes it like a barbecue sauce. And as you know, there was no salt added in this recipe at all. And that was my main concern. I was debating of adding a little bit of salt into that marinade, but I thought I'm gonna do this recipe exactly how it says in the book. No salt, and I'll tell you what, it still tastes absolutely fantastic. I think the soy sauce and that ketchup did add a little bit of salt, and the vinegar really helped tenderize this meat. You definitely need a 24-hour marinade on a chuck roast like this to get it nice and tender. But I'll tell you what, this 1967 recipe still holds up today, and I would highly suggest anyone out there to give this a try. They knew what they were doing back in the day because this is delicious. For a chuck roast, that's crazy. I'm super happy I tried this recipe out, and I will definitely be doing this again. That char on there is actually really good. It doesn't taste burnt, it's just a nice charcoal, charred flavor. Some things I might do differently next time I cook it. After the first few flips, once it's got a nice crust on there, I think I would move it over to the indirect side on the grill and then continue to flip it over every 7 minutes or so and marinate it that way till it got to an internal of about 130, 135. This was at about 145 degrees and it still came out fantastic. So you can cook it to that high of a temperature and it'll still be perfect. I don't think a chuck roast is something you really want to serve too rare just because it's not the most tender piece of meat. But this is really good, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a like. I'm gonna go ahead and put everything I like to use down in the description below. And if you are interested in seeing more old recipes like this, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and you can do that right over here. If you want to see another one of my barbecue videos, you can check this one out right over here. But most importantly, guys, get out there and smoke something good.